Admit Amy. All right. So welcome to all of you intrepid DLM 120 instructors and hopeful future instructors. I thought that I would ask first if everybody wants to quickly kind of go around the Zoom room and just sort of share their DLM topic so we get a sense of what's out there in terms of what people are thinking of, or if you're not teaching a DLM in the fall, just to maybe share your thoughts or why the heck you're here. And so I'm super excited. I'm teaching a DLM. I haven't taught since January 2019. And that was only one course. And so I'm really itching to teach, and my DLM is about food culture and identity in the Americas. So we're going to compare US, Peru, and Mexico and think about how people use food to understand who they are and to talk about who they are. So I'm super excited about that. Patrick is my co-presenter here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your course real quick?
Mine, the DLM2 is a course in personal narrative. So it will center, I think it will center on family, although we'll negotiate that sort of central topic, but I hope and expect that it's going to involve research into their own personal history, perhaps the history of their parents. It might have to do with food or Christmas toys or all sorts of things that can become central to a narrative. I taught a similar course as an FYS to a group of freshmen, and it was a successful undertaking. So I'm really looking forward to doing that.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm just going to call on people and move around my Zoom room. So Jen, you're next. And maybe you and Lenny want to play off of each other.
Right, because Lenny and I are designing a cross-divisional DLM called Science on Stage. And we're looking at using plays to understand scientific ideas and scientific ideas to open up a certain number of plays.
Cool. Lenny, do you have anything to add about?
That's a great synopsis. and maybe as much as we know right now.
Perfect. All right, next on my Zoom screen is Jamie.
Hi, everyone. So this is I taught it as an FYS, but now I'm converting it to a DLM 120. So it's anthropology and Disney. And so we're looking at Disney as cultural artifact and influencer, and we're using a lot of concepts from cultural anthropology in particular to analyze what they'll see in princess movies over time, starting with Snow White and ending with Moana. And we'll also do some, if we can swing it, some virtual reality as the visual component or another visual component of the course through, just Google Cardboard that they can get at home. And they'll try to visit a Disney theme park and analyze some of the rides there through all of the VR recordings that are out there of Disney rides. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. Shauna?
Sorry. I am retooling an FYS that was a retooled argument and inquiry first-year seminar that I taught before I came here, called Imagining Home, Religious and Cultural Identities in Diaspora. So it's, I have a lot of assignments already kind of that are presentation oriented and first-year seminar oriented, but I struggle with grading. So that's my big question on that one, on the oral front.
Yeah, that is something that I'm sure we're all thinking about right now, grading and what are we getting ourselves into for the spring. Matthew.
Yeah, I don't currently have a DLM on the books. I'm not scheduled to teach one yet, though I'm sure that is in the future for me. One that I imagine I will try to craft, it will be centered around an FYS I've taught on, it was titled Creativity, Design, and Making. And it's a very heavily presentation-based, group presentation and solo presentation-based class.
Great, thanks. Ava.
So I'm also retooling an FYS that worked well. It is 5th century Athens, focused on Socrates and Alcibiades, and it really is all about citizenship and loyalty to the state and betrayal to the state. So it's all sorts of fun stuff.
Great. Jeff.
Hello. Well, one reason I'm here is that I'm the co-convener of this learning community. So that's the main reason, one main reason that I'm here. I'm not teaching a DLM2 this spring, but I did just teach a DLM1 in block 2. It was also a retool of an FYS I taught last center term. It was called Acting, Creating, Thinking, and we went through a bit of the anthropology of learning and education, and then we partnered with the glassblowing studio and Professor King, and I had the students do some glassblowing with some student mentors, and then they wrote an autoethnographic reflection on the process of learning that skill.
Great, and it'll be nice to hear your kind of experiences with DLM1. You're not the only one in this group who taught a DLM1, but to kind of think about the continuity between the two parts of the experience. Patton.
Hi, everybody. I am teaching a class called Freakonomics, which is really a course in creative problem solving with a nifty name. We are going to read some of the Freakonomics books, but it's really about kind of reframing problems, gathering data, analyzing data, and thinking about solutions. So this was an FYS a few years ago where we did a survey of all the first-year students and tried to think about how to mitigate the negative impacts of stress on campus. And so I'm trying to think about that creatively. What are the causes, and what are some little things that that we can do? I've got about 50% of my attention here and 50% with the 6-year-old. So I might be video on and off and things like that. And I apologize, but that's just where I am in life.
No, thank you for being here. Andre.
Yeah, I'm teaching a seminar, the ANSOS seminar on Homo sapiens origins to Anthropocene. And I have the ambition of converting that into a DLM2. And at least in theory, from what I think I know about it, which could be, both could be completely wrong. I like the idea of the oral component of the DLM, and I would like to, forward that up into the seminar I'm teaching now, and which just seems like a great way to have students be engaged in the material. So, I honestly, I'm very much in the early stages. I have taught this once before. It went just fine, but I have some other ideas, and I'm meeting with Robin right after this for her to tell me what I should do anyway. So
that's what we do at CTL. We tell you what you should do.
I'm open to anyone telling me what I should do right now. So please.
Well, we'll see. And then finally, Amy, tell us about your DLM.
So I'm teaching Monuments and the Making of Meaning, which I've also taught during center term before. It is, that was focused mainly on Civil War monuments in Kentucky, and we took a lot of field trips. So for a long semester, I'm expanding it a little bit, and we're going to be looking at monuments worldwide before we narrow down to more local monuments. It's not only about kind of the significance of the appearance of the monuments, but also how important place is and decision making about public art in general. So for some of the oral communication things, I think we're going to start with an academic paper and then turn toward communicating for a general audience. I'm thinking about doing some kind of podcast, but then yesterday I went to the Google, what was it? Google View.
The virtual field trips.
Yes. So I'm thinking about starting with, thinking about the worldwide monuments. We might do some virtual tours of those, and then maybe make our own in a cemetery in Kentucky. I don't know. We'll figure it out. So.
CTL will tell you what to do. It'll be fun. So I put in the chat a link. It's a link to our programming page. And I'd like you to check out, there's a handout associated with this that will have some of the text that, some of the text I'm going to show on the screen, and then some text that's too much text for the screen. So I put the link to the page, scroll down to where you see today's workshop, the Scaffolding and Evaluating Oral Communication, and there should be a link to the handout. It might be handy to have that open. While you're doing that, I'll just share that our goals for today's workshop are to give you some ways to think about, to break down oral communication that may help you evaluate the different pieces, and talk about the rubric that we've been developing for helping to kind of think through what we're asking our students to do. And then I also hope that you come away with some concrete ideas about oral communication assignments that you might use for your students. And so those are kind of the two pieces: thinking about evaluating, thinking about scaffolding, and creating assignments for oral communication. I wanted to, before we do that though, I just wanted to remind everybody of what we've gotten ourselves into by looking here. So can you see this? I gotta unplug this other monitor. It's confusing me.
Yeah, it's there.
It's there?
Yep.
Oh, now I've confused it completely. Are we looking at the DLM learning goals?
There we are.
Yes.
Yes. All right. So this is a lot of text, but you've already seen this text when you filled out your course approval form. Just to remind you of the things that a DLM course in general needs to do. So the way to think about this is, the first one really is metacognition, thinking about the process of learning, or students reflecting on their own process. The one in purple is obviously the one that we're really concerned with today, thinking about effective communication in different ways. The third one is basically reading and listening to things critically and looking at things. And the fourth is often shorthanded as information literacy, kind of gathering, evaluating information, thinking about how to use evaluation. So these are the four things that the DLM courses should do. And then the next slide is also a lot of text, but this is what you said on the course approval form that you would accomplish in the class in terms of communication. So there's an element of visual communication, not just as an illustration, but as a mode of expression. DLM 120s should do 3 different graded presentations of oral communication, and the course approval form gives some specifics about these that relate to kind of length, balancing content and concision, audience, and then opportunities for rehearsal and iteration, as well as a written communication piece. So these are the things, in addition to all of the beautiful topical goals that you all are thinking about for your course, the kind of content-driven questions that you want to answer. These are the ways that these courses should appeal to communication. So like I said, lots of text that's also on the handout. It's also on the course approval form, but I wanted to kind of give the bigger context of what these courses are intended to do before we turn specifically to oral communication. It sounds like a lot. We're gonna have to see in practice how it works out to do all of these things, plus Disney, food, narrative, creative problem solving within a class. So with that said, then let's turn to the first piece of this, which is going to be guided by Patrick, thinking about the rubric. You'll find the rubric in the handout as you scroll down. But Patrick's really going to talk about kind of where this rubric came from and why some of these pieces are there.
I was really glad to be on this committee, and I was very glad that we needed an oral communication rubric, because it was something that I thought I could do on a committee where I feel like I'm very often swimming in the deep end. The rubric is geared to oral communication, and the adjustments that I made to it, the rubric that came to us from various kinds of sources tended to concentrate upon rhetorical skills, and I didn't think it had paid enough attention to issues of performance. What I'll preface this by saying I very much feel here like I'm singing to the choir. The kinds of things that I'm talking about today are things that I've seen all of you do very well. So understand that I'm just dealing with my own kind of nomenclature here today. Most of the things that are in the oral communication rubric deal with, I'm going to talk about 4 things today. First, confidence, right? Intention and intentionality. If you look around the internet on public speaking websites, intention and intentionality are often referred to as passion or objectives or purpose or interest or excitement, but it all has to do with what your goal is as a speaker. I'll talk just a little bit about ownership, sometimes referred to as authenticity or being yourself. I have a certain way of relating to that. And finally, just the notion of relationship, which I think is essential to all good oral communication. One of the things that I think about oral communication, and I just, it's underscored by everything that you've said about what it is that you're going to be teaching, is that it's grounded in effective storytelling. And effective storytelling is the work of good storytellers. A thing that I want my students to accept is that they are storytellers and that they can be more effective at these performative tasks if they pay attention to a few fundamental concerns. The first thing is to have something to offer. And this is the same thing that we talk about with respect to rhetorical criteria. It's the same thing that we'll teach in DLM 1. You want to have something to offer in your writing. Yes, I always want actors. I don't care what they're doing in my plays. I want them to have something to offer when they come on stage. I want them to feel like they are the play, right? And in these terms, right, what are the things that you can have to offer? First is a strong and compelling central message or action or thesis or argument, depending upon what the intent of your presentation is, whether it's a story, persuasive speech, reports and analysis, demonstrations, have something to offer. And the way that you structure something to offer is through an effective, capable organization. I want students to make a choice regarding an organizational structure. I want them to support that central argument with specific and interesting details. I want them to be clear with themselves about what their task is. Are they solving a problem, describing a condition, engaging your audience in a specific set of circumstances? You should know what you want at any point in your presentation, and you should support your presentation with quality information. That's the first page, really, of the rubric. It's all grounded in rhetorical criteria. It's stuff that we use all the time. The second page deals with some things which I think are more performative. And the first of these, in my estimation, is ownership. I want my speakers, as I want my actors, to own the space and to know the space. I want them to stand on the floor, and I want them to believe that they belong there. That's their space for the duration of this performance. And with that in mind, I want them to own the time. I want them to be patient, to expect and embrace missteps and mistakes, be comfortable with silence, and above all, take the time to breathe. I want them last to own their own topic, their own message. I believe about actors as I believe about speakers. If you want to be interesting, be interested. Be interested in your topic and communicate your interest to your audience. That's all simply ownership of one's own role as a storyteller. The next thing is relationship. First of all, to realize that you are in a relationship. You're establishing a relationship with your audience, and goodwill is powerful and valuable. We'll talk, the rubric talks about eye contact. Well, it's a little more than eye contact. It's seeing the room, seeing your audience, seeing your partners in the work. You can't respond to what you don't see. I want speakers to know and respond to the energy in the room, not to be afraid to change and respond to that energy. Be in the moment. This is stuff that we teach in acting classes all the time. Realize that what you have is a conversation, a relationship, and you want to bring your best storyteller to the relationship. And finally, and this is, it's not even in the rubric except as a kind of subtext. You should prepare and prepare and prepare, and you should practice and practice and practice. I recommend that people don't memorize. They should practice their presentation and prepare for impromptu delivery. They ought to visualize their presentation, practice it enough that you have it down on muscle, right? This, I do this as an actor. Heck, I do it as a director. I think a lot of us do it as teachers. We visualize these presentations and we get them down into our own body and down into our experience before we make a presentation. And that allows us the kind of confidence that we need to be able to function. So that's what I've got to say about the rubric.
And just to kind of, this was in my head, but maybe didn't come out of my mouth. This is a rubric that the General Education Committee, or that Patrick specifically within the General Education Committee has been working on as part of our progress toward thinking about what we want our students to be able to do. What does effective oral communication look like? And then eventually to be part of the assessment process for the new gen ed, right? So the idea is this is kind of our move toward articulating what effective oral communication looks like for assessment purposes. But I personally found this to be very useful in breaking it down in my own head, right? I think I have a lot more experience thinking explicitly about what good written communication looks like, right? I can kind of come up with some things that I'm looking for to know, to evaluate the written communication. And I have a harder time being explicit in my mind about the things I'm looking for when I'm listening to or watching an oral presentation. And so even though this rubric is kind of developed in the assessment context, I think it's actually really informing how I'm thinking about my teaching. So just to kind of say what this rubric is. Andre asked about, says we don't have the rubric yet. Well, this is the rubric.
Okay, I'm completely confused.
So did you find that, did you follow the link for today's workshop?
I followed the link to teaching conversations, handouts from PTL programming.
Nope, follow the link and scroll down to today's workshop, which is scaffolding and evaluating oral communication. Yeah, thanks for sending the PDF. I wanted to send the link because I wanted you to be able to find it again, but Lenny, thank you. Because just to know that handout is living somewhere and not just floating around in a Zoom chat that's gone. So the rubric that we're talking about that Patrick was kind of walking us through is on pages 2 and 3 of that document that Lenny attached, or the link on the workshops page. So questions for Patrick. Like I said, to me, this is extremely helpful to start to sort of be explicit about what I'm implicitly watching and listening for in presentations. But I wanted to pause for your questions.
So Patrick, I know something that we've talked about on the Gen Ed committee a little bit is the idea of some of our students and temperaments, and how do we help a student, for example, on the second page with the performance criteria, how might we help a student go from, say, basic or fails to meet the standard to proficient or distinguished? So do you see that? I know we've talked about that in our meetings, but I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
It's sort of dealt with in the subtext of the oral communication rubric. I mean, a thing that, we'll go back to Stanislavski, right? And the late 19th century and the arrival of the scientific training of the actor, right? Stanislavski was an actor, and he felt himself that he wasn't always on, you know, but he saw actors that he thought were always just brilliant at being on, and he set out to try to create a method whereby your average schlub, right, as an actor could gain some sort of understanding about whatever it was that these very effective communicators were doing that seemed so inspired. And he arrived finally on something that ended up at the end called the method of physical actions. And it had to do with focusing one's attention on tasks, right? That if you're focused on a particular goal and a particular task, you tend to be able to shut out all of the noise that pulls you out of yourself in these circumstances. It goes along with relaxation, with an understanding of given circumstances. There are lots of things that exist in Stanislavski's system, but I think the thing that I tend to focus my students on is, what are you trying to do, right? If your task is, say, as a speaker, right, you're looking at me, and your task is to relax me and to enthuse me in what it is that you're bringing forward, your own work is going to be a lot more focused on a lot less concerned with how you look and whether you're achieving what you want. Now, I don't know if that helps or makes sense, but it's sort of what underpins my work in the rubric.
Thank you. I mean, I think what I love about how you describe that is thinking in particular about a DLM, and thinking about this as if I can do this somewhat successfully, that this is a community building opportunity with our first years. And so I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think oral communication happens in the context of community. I mean, they're going to be delivering their presentations to this small club of people that we hope like them, and that helps the work as well. And they should like their audience. I think it's always a good idea to feel like you like your audience. That goodwill helps so very much in presentation.
Are there other questions for Patrick about the rubric or approach to some of these elements?
I have a question. I'm wondering if incorporating lots and lots of low stakes opportunities to do this kind of presentation is a good way to go about scaffolding it. I try to work a lot of low stakes writing into my writing seminars, and I'm wondering if the same kind of plan of attack works for presentations as well. I mean, I would assume it does. It's just that it seems like presentations are always considered so high stakes for students that I'm wondering if there's a way to lower that bar a little bit to get them jump started.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one thing that I will certainly have I won't have students who are devising or presenting whole stories from the outset, right? I might ask them to give me their first 45 seconds or minute and a half of whatever the presentation is, and then we talk about that. Yes, I absolutely think that whatever you can do to get people up on their feet, inhabiting space and a situation, and owning their position as presenters, those can be very, very small tasks. And I think that's a really good idea, Jeff. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'll actually jump off of that to do the next section, and then we'll have time at the end for kind of more synthetic questions, because I wanted to talk a little bit about ideas for scaffolding different assignments to move students toward these things. And just to also say sort of parenthetically that I don't know that our goal for our DLM 120 students needs to be that they hit distinguished in all of these categories, right? As Andre mentioned, he's going to be incorporating a lot of oral communication into the senior seminar, right? The idea is that this is this sort of a beginning point that is leading them to continue to practice these things. But I wanted to share this book, which is cited at the top of the fourth page of the handout. This is available through our library as an ebook, which means you don't even have to come win the race to check it out. You can look at it from your home. And this has been really useful to me to think about what oral communication looks like across the disciplines. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple key points that were really useful to me. One is that we might think about oral communication as both informal and more formal opportunities to tell stories or to present. And that informal oral communication could be things like, full class discussion, partner work, the really kind of basic bread and butter of how students are communicating with each other in the context of the classroom. But that even these informal communication, it's not necessarily as low stakes as we might feel that it is, right? Because we're up there talking to the class and we've gotten over our fear of doing that. And so even though we think about things like contributing to the full class discussion on an article as low stakes, it actually may not be for students. So even informal communication needs to kind of be taught and practiced and built up over the semester. Another point is that we may think about things like class discussions as just really intuitive, right? The students just contribute to the conversation. But in fact, different disciplines have different expectations for what it means to discuss. The kinds of ways that you might approach a text in a philosophy class or a social justice class or a math class might be really different. And so it's worth spending some time kind of discussing explicitly what the norms are of discussion in this discipline, or what kinds of things are good contributions, what do good questions look like. So even things that we think of as just kind of intuitive everyday opportunities for oral communication that are very low stakes actually probably require a little explicit attention, especially for DLM courses where students are still sort of being socialized into what it means to be in a college classroom. So the handout provides some examples of informal communication activities, and there are a lot more in the text. I wanted to share a couple of examples that I didn't put in the handout for you. So for instance, you can go beyond kind of full class discussion or talk with your partner about these questions to opportunities that have a little bit more structure, but are still kind of informal, just regular class period kinds of things. So for instance, you could have students to practice supporting a position with evidence. You could have them role play an interview with a public radio station about a topic, maybe even a reading. Maybe one student is the author of the book and another student is asking the questions of the interview, and they can walk through this role play as a really informal oral communication activity within class. An example, there's a whole table full of visual activities. So for our visual communication component, one example for a learning goal that has to do with communicating principles in a visual format. The student could construct a visual that explains the basics of some course content to middle schoolers. So they can design in high-tech or low-tech ways how to explain this thing for middle schoolers, and then talk through that visual, kind of explain what goes into that visual to the class, just kind of going around the room explaining why they chose to depict this thing in this way. And again, that's kind of incorporated into the class experience, but is a way for students to practice some of these pieces. And there's some other examples on the handout. For formal communication assignments, the book, I think, really usefully walks through a series of questions for you to ask yourself. What's the role of this assignment? How is this playing into my overall arc of the class? Why are students doing it? What do I hope that they learn here? I think that a very interesting question for us to all think about is, what does this genre of oral communication look like in your discipline? How do archaeologists tell stories? How do we tell them to the public, and how do we tell them to each other? And how are those things different? What does this look like for archaeologists, or whatever discipline you're thinking about? And then some of these questions are echoed on the rubric, right? What's the purpose? What are you trying to do here in giving this presentation? Is it to get people hooked on the topic? Is it to defend a position or a policy, right? What's your goal as a communicator? And who is the audience that you're trying to communicate with? And then the other ones are kind of classic transparent assignment questions. What do students need to know and be able to do to complete the assignment? And what does a successful one look like? And that idea of what does a successful performance look like really resonated with me. And for those of you who are my vintage or older, you'll remember the really great faculty retreat that everybody mentions as the shining example of the faculty retreat when we talked about writing, teaching writing. One of the things I really took away from that was think about whether your writing assignment exists in the wild. Is this a thing that people actually write? Or is this kind of a series of questions that you want them to ask within your particular course? So I like that way of framing oral communication assignments too. Is this a thing that people do out there? Give an academic paper in a discipline, do an interview on NPR, make a TikTok, make a policy statement during a political debate. And then what does a good one look like, right? If you can find it in the wild, you can have students watch examples and learn to kind of break down what makes them effective or not, and then try to reproduce them. And that's how you might scaffold towards a more formal presentation. So there's a couple of great examples that I've pulled out for the handout. And there's a whole table of other ones in the book that I won't go into too much, but I like this because it pushes me to think beyond like an academic paper in archaeology, which is my kind of go-to. What does a presentation look like? Well, give a presentation as if you were an archaeologist at a conference. Well, that's one kind of formal oral communication, but it's not one that necessarily any of my students will ever do in the future. And so you can take a look at the examples on the handout. Notice that they all kind of lay out like, what do we want students to do here? And then how are they doing it within this oral communication example? And all of them kind of exist in the wild. They're things that we can point to as things that people actually do to communicate with each other in particular genres and disciplines.
If I might, Robin,
yeah.
One of the things that I think you're referring to here is, again, in the use of space, that if your intention is different, if the delivery nature is different, your students need to feel confident with adjusting the space to suit their needs. They need to be, in some respects, their own director in defining how that space best works for them in terms of the goals that they're setting forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And then the last thing I wanted to do is just give an example in the handout of how you might put together several kinds of informal activities or opportunities for oral communication, because obviously a formal presentation, if it's something like a pitch for grant funding for a particular project, right? And students have been learning about all of these pieces. There's a lot that goes into that, right? There's how to use evidence to support a point. There's how do you communicate persuasively that your solution is the one that should be funded. And so thinking about how to use the informal communication that you might be doing in your class, regular class periods or very low stakes things, and how do those then align with the pieces that are going to go into the more formal presentations. And I gave one example in the handout, and there are some other examples in the book. So if you can't tell, I highly recommend this book. I just think it's really practical and will get you thinking about assignments that will work with your content, with what you the kinds of stories you want students to be telling in your class. Okay. So what I wanted to do next actually is send everybody to a breakout room for 10 minutes with 1 or 2 other people to share an idea, either from reading the rubric and hearing Patrick talk about the pieces that go into oral communication, or from kind of going through these different assignments. Share a concrete idea that you might take into your DLM 120. So that's your task. Share with your partner or your group of 3 an idea, a concrete idea that you will institute or think about how to institute in your DLM 120. And we will come back after 10 minutes and have time for general questions and conversation. So there's the rooms. Those of you not teaching a 120, oops. Jeff, okay. Do you want to go into a room and talk to people?
Sure, yeah, put me in a
Alright.
room. I think that'd be great.
I will send you to a room.
Join.
Welcome back. All right. So hopefully you had a chance to apply some of these ideas. And I know that there were a lot of ideas and things to think about, but hopefully you had a chance to apply at least one of them to thinking about your class for the spring. What questions emerged, or what great ideas did you have while you were in the breakout rooms that you'd like to bring back to the full group?
One thing Jeff Shenton asked is, because I started talking a little bit about some of the vocal production mechanics, the stuff that Jen did in the pedagogy lunch back in the before times, and that Patrick has done at other times at retreats. And if there's some kind of resource that can be generated that lays out some of those, you know, just about the arrival at the lectern or whatever the speaking place is going to be, you know, just addressing that as its own little exercise, about groundedness and connection to the floor, about breathing, you know.
So what we have, this is actually from that pedagogy workshop, the link that I just put in the chat. And so we can continue to add to that, especially people who have taught that kind of thing explicitly. If you have something that works, you can let me know and we can continue to flesh out this piece. That's not something that I've ever explicitly taught, even though I sort of know it when I see it, right? When they kind of come up when a student is confident in the space or is not, but that's not something that I've thought about explicitly teaching. Patrick, do you have any good?
I do this, and this relates to Jeff's talk about scaffolded performance, is one of the things that I will do first of all is simply the exercise is to walk into the space, relax in the space, own the space, tell me your name, tell me you're glad to be here, and find a way to finish that thing. And so this isn't any kind of performance other than walking in and taking ownership of yourself as a speaker in the space. Because I think those are skills that we should practice. And once we've got them practiced, then we can put them to use in lots of other ways. But they're the things that I think are most easy to forget in creating oral communication, is that these very simple things about walking into a space. I'm always reminded of Richard Nixon, who as a president, he had the unfortunate fact of always having to remember how to walk, right? That he was such an awkward man, and his performance anxiety was so great that even when he'd been president for 8 years, he was always remembering how to walk. Nobody ever taught him to breathe while he was doing his work, right? And I want people to relax into that notion of just being a human being in the space.
So that's where you would start, because I have to say, thinking about the rubric, there's a lot of categories and students can't master them all or practice them all at once, right? And
Yes.
So you would start with that some of the things on that second page about, you know, occupying the space and thinking about your voice, and those, you start with those physical pieces, or is there somewhere else that you like? How do you build?
Yeah, that's really where I start with the performative end. The rhetorical matters tend to be more complex and require attention over time. But we can right now walk into a space. We're all human beings in these rooms, right? And so we could perform within the situation where we are right now, and find a way to relax and be a welcoming, aware, and present human being. Those are all things that are practicable and learnable.
Robin, or maybe Amy or Jeff, in sort of on the flip side of that, as I look at the rubric on the first page, a lot of that seems to be things that you would also work on in writing. And so central message, organization, those ideas, how much of that was covered in, say, a rubric for DLM-1 that we can then use to build on in DLM-2?
I hope a lot. I like the sequence, because I think the oral communication thing appropriately happens after they've had some serious work in all of the rhetorical skills that are important. And those rhetorical skills are essential. Again, I think it's absolutely vital for people to feel like they have something substantial to offer when they enter the space. It's so calming to feel like you have some merit as a person and as a presenter. And all of those rhetorical skills are things that provide fuel to confidence as a communicator. And a confident communicator is a better communicator, even if she's bad, you know?
Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I think my answer, and I don't know if Robin or Jeff would agree with this, is that that is the direction in which we hope to head. And that's where I'll leave it for right now.
Understood.
Yeah, I guess I would also just add that I was struck when Patrick was speaking earlier about the rubric with some of the language that he was using. So these are places that I ended up going with my students too, in terms of thinking about ownership over ideas, ownership over space, a rhetorical space, the idea of establishing a relationship with a specific audience, and in speaking to that audience with intention. This idea that it's an iterative process, that we have to return to it over and over again, that that we're always revising as we're writing that stuff. So there are corollary pieces to the rhetorical side and to the performative side, I think, that speak to one another, and yet also at the same time, the skills don't necessarily translate one to the other in terms of actually performing them either. So when you're being a good writer is not necessarily to be a good presenter, and yet I also had the opposite. In my DLM 1 class, I actually had a student who was an award-winning debater in high school and was actually a pretty mediocre writer. So so thinking about how do we talk through the translation of those two of these different skills, while at the same time the fact that they are so similar in the first place, the way that we talk about them, even though the transferability is still a difficult piece.
I think you're like 80% of the way there, right there, Jeff, just being able to separate out what these different things are. If you see these things as discrete entities, then you can analyze them and talk about them. And that's one of the intentions of the rubric, is to simply separate out some of these things, so they're not sort of druidic, mysterious skills. They're things that we can look at and say, oh yeah, that's there. Let's talk about what that's doing, how that's working.
Yeah, I think from a process perspective, we had already been using the AAC&U value rubric for writing, and so we hadn't really been thinking in quite in-depth terms about oral communication. Sort of Patrick took this. I think probably what we need to do in terms of assessment is to look at these rhetorical criteria and the AAC&U value rubric for writing and make sure that they're aligned, right? So that it's really clear, even in the way that we're communicating among ourselves, and also assessing that these things are linked, right? But then they're also distinct in the way that they look, or that you go about doing them. I would say, from what I've heard, and maybe those of you who could speak to DLM 1s in the fall, I would guess this crop of students had less opportunity to iterate on the writing, just because of the block schedule, and I mean, how it's so hard to iterate multiple versions of things in such a compressed time. So I would say that where our students are this spring is probably going to be a little bit different from where they end up landing in general in DLM 120s, just because of the way that the fall worked out this particular fall. So I want to be mindful of time and formally kind of close and just say thanks for being here, even though you have a lot of other things that you could be doing with your time. But also, if you want to keep talking, or you have specific questions that we didn't get to, I will stick around. I noticed a couple of questions having to do with kind of thinking through the remote or virtual components of this. And I think Jeff and I had talked about having a second workshop in early January that would think sort of specifically about how to deal with the questions that emerge from, either teaching remotely or having students who are remote in this context. So hopefully we can hold those over until then. So thank you all, and feel free to stick around. Otherwise, have a great weekend and good luck with that grading.
Thank you all.
Yeah, Patrick, just looking at this, I just think I can just see myself kind of pulling out some of these lines and saying, on this assignment, we're going to think about voice. We're going to think about creating a connection with your audience, and also having students analyze things that exist there out in the world in terms of how is this person creating a relationship. Or
if you can see a thing, you can start to design a way in which to in some micro way, bring that into your process. Yeah.